Okay, I think
In
we're
the
good
house.
All right,
good
hello.
to start. Everyone's mic work?
Yes, I think
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm super stoked for this panel because it really gets to the core of Web3 by objectively discussing its infrastructure, specifically APIs, and the challenges of building them and scaling them. And here to discuss that are the people building them. So we have Nader on the end, who is one of the most friendly, approachable, informative DevRels in Web3 right now, working at Edge and Node, which is the team building the graph. For anyone who isn't aware, the graph really sits at the center of the Web3 stack as a decentralized data layer. Nader will tell us more about that later. Really implore everyone to check out the project and see how you can get involved. We have E.G. Galano here on my right, who is the co-founder and chief infrastructure engineer at Infura, the pioneers of APIs to connect builders to Ethereum as well as IPFS. E.G. is a deeply compassionate leader. This morning he was helping set up the Infura booth. He is also a leader that's extremely customer-centric, and I think that that's very evident as over 400,000 builders use Infura today. So how many people, show of hands, use Infura tools? Okay, I see a few. That's great. So you can thank EG later for those. And lastly, we have Temoc Weber. So he's hailing from Sweden. Has come a long way to be with us, and he's a newcomer to Web3. He is the CEO and co-founder of Gateway FM, founded just last year, so they've been up and running about 8 months. They have a multi-chain API cloud-based solution. So, new to this space, but already bringing such meaningful solutions, which is certainly inspiring for any of the emerging projects attending or that are here today, and also for all those Web 2 outliers who haven't quite made the switch. And I'm Clarissa. I'm a technical writer at Consensus. So I think, yeah. So intros are done. Let's get right to the challenges, and then we'll get to some solutions. And then I would love to open up the floor for your questions. So step up to the mic when the time is ready. E.G., so I want to start with you. You were one of the first to build an API solution for Ethereum, launching Infura in 2016. What are the most common barriers you have seen to scalability over the past six years, keeping in mind that Infura is a partially free service?
Yeah, so there's the traditional scaling issues, which is just you can't project the growth. You can't project traffic. Typically, when you're building a project, you're aware, say you're building a game, you're going to launch the game in May or something, and you can start to prepare. When you're an infrastructure provider, you don't have the ability to prepare. You don't know, your customers aren't really telling you when they expect to put out, say, a commercial that's going to launch during the Super Bowl, or anything that's going to put this orders of magnitude of growth on what your standard traffic pattern is. So you have to be prepared for that. You can't really capacity plan. You have to make sure that you're architecting systems that can scale almost limitlessly. And aside from that, there's also some operational things as well when it comes to network upgrades in particular.
Okay, great. That's a great summary. I'm sure many of you have experienced those challenges. Nader, I'm going to pass it to you because you're building a very unique type of API, a subgraph. So if you could tell us about subgraphs, their functions, and maybe get into some of the challenges you've seen indexers have to scale them on the graph network.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. Subgraphs are essentially just APIs that run on the graph protocol, and the graph protocol is an indexing and querying protocol for developers and applications to be able to build more robust applications on top of blockchain data. So when you think of a traditional database, like a relational database or a NoSQL database, these databases are optimized for both read and write operations, whereas blockchains do not have data that's easily able to be read. So most applications need functionality like full text search, relational data, sorting, filtering, things like that. But you can't really get that by querying a blockchain directly through an RPC endpoint. So subgraphs allow developers to model their data in a GraphQL schema, deploy their API to the decentralized network, and you're now given kind of the functionality that you would expect out of like a traditional database with all the robust functionality that you would kind of need for a modern app.
Cool. Okay, cool. Save your questions about the graph for later on. And now, Temoc. So Gateway FM is a multi-chain solution, and you guys, from what I understand, specifically have an API for L2s. So, and this morning, E.g., you said faster chains grow faster about our L2s. So kind of like foreshadowing some of the unique challenges that they may face. Can you speak to those? What have you seen in offering an L2 API?
Yeah, so I think there are two parts. As soon as you go multi-chain, one of the biggest issues that you have is really understanding how those chains work in comparison to what exists today already. So it's almost like getting to grow up with a new kid. It takes time to really understand how the nodes work, understanding how the API's method interact. And actually, one of the biggest issues that we have with new chains is actually the disk space. A lot of documentation is not there. One of the reasons that the way that we're building things is not your traditional decentralized. We call it more, you could say, distributed. We go bare metal. That has some good opportunities, but at the same time, some big challenges, which I always say is you need to have very, very specific hardware requirements. And a lot of the documentation out there is not really ready. So the time that you have to spend in order to build those nodes, it's quite extensive. So after a lot of time spent on that, we decided to go back to AWS, do the testing there, really get the configurations, and then go back to bare metal. That's a little bit what we see with all these new chains. The way that you need to build them are separate from each other. A lot of the new chains are either EVM compatible, so they'll have a lot of similarities, but we're trying to go for the more complex ones because we see that there's more RPC needs at the end of the day. And then you have to spend a lot more time on all the methods, really testing it, battle testing it because they haven't been out there for so long. So we spend a lot of time on the testing period part just to make sure that we have a good service. When it comes to the L2, we're very specific on CK rollups. We think that the lock-in period there for specific segments like wallets is going to be quite intrinsical. And I would say for there, the biggest issue right now is still very centralized. We know that this year there'll be more decentralized, but that's a point of failure. And also the calls are a bit complex because you're not really debugging too much. I would say just in general, those are kind of the discoveries that we had in this short period of time.
Thank you. Okay. So I guess we're moving through this a little bit faster than I anticipated. But you know, we're all here to build, and it's the spirit of the event and kind of Web3 at large. So I want to open up now with a pretty general question. You know, what advice do you have for the builders with us today and you know, watching at home? What advice can you give them, you know, to scale their own APIs and even, you know, selecting a service?
I work with a lot of developers, and I'm kind of new to the Web3 space. I've been a software engineer for about 9 years, and I've only been in the Web3 space for about 1 year. And I think one thing that I see a lot of times in this space is that there's so many options for developers to build on, and a lot of the incentives that are kind of built into these protocols with tokens make people go out there and kind of like shill the thing that they're, you know, wanting to go up as opposed to the right tool for the right job. So I think like as a developer, kind of really understanding the ecosystem and where everything fits in and knowing that the right tool for the right job exists and like when and where to use that is really important. And not just like sticking to one thing that you think is going to do everything, but instead like understand like where the graph might fit in or where IPFS or where RWE might fit in and kind of use it. And the only way to do that is to kind of do some research and do some reading and understand kind of the Web3 stack or the Web3 ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, that one's for everyone to answer. So, Temoc, if you want to go next.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the main things that we see, I mean, there's a lot of development happening both in Ethereum and a lot of these new L1 chains. I think everybody's trying to tackle the same problem, which is scalability. It's not a single KPI, it's a multi-layer KPI. So to actually increase the actual APIs is not just like, okay, I'm just going to scale the infrastructure and everything's going to be okay. One of the major issues that we see, it's actually creating a good operational support system to actually understand what the problems and react them in a good way or in a fast way. And some of the things that we do is actually, we build this from the ground up through CI/CD, which allows us to do, between 5 to 10 software deliveries per day. We then automatically test it and then deploy it in production within a couple hours. That gives a lot better opportunity for developers to come and test. And if they have problems, we're able to react pretty fast. I think today one of the biggest pain points is if you have a new developer, they come and they interact with the RPC, it doesn't work. They have to discover where they need to go and get the information. It could be a Discord channel, it could be a Telegram channel. They get a bit lost and it's a bit difficult. But I would say it's a very exciting space and they should not give up. The infrastructure is a key space for the future of Web3. That's what we hear.
Let's see. So the question,
I mean, yeah. Like, so, what's your advice to the builders in the audience and watching from home, to scale their own APIs or even to choose a service? What are the key things they should be thinking about?
So one of the things that I've been seeing as people are starting to build more NFT applications on top of Ethereum and other EVM-compatible blockchains is that they want to get to market quickly, and they're picking a solution that's immediately available that solves their problem. And that works. That works fine to get your product out to market. But take a close look at the technologies that you're using and make sure that there's something like an API continuity plan. Is this API going to be something that'll continue servicing your users for many years in its current form? Is your application and the API that you're using, whether it's something you're building yourself or something that you're using from us or another API provider, is it something that's going to change underneath your application? That's one of the things that's affected me as somebody that has used some things in the NFT space where maybe the content disappeared because it was no longer hosted somewhere, or the company that put out the product pivoted into a different direction, and it's not that your assets on the blockchain weren't accessible anymore, but it was either a lot more difficult to access or you had to go through a significant amount of technical steps to migrate your content from one space into another so that you can have it in perpetuity. So as you're designing, try to keep in mind that our customers, our users, the ecosystem, the people that are going to be consuming this content are going into it without understanding everything that holds it up. And let's try to build that stuff responsibly.
That's very, very well said. Great advice, guys. So on that note, why did each of you decide to build APIs for Web3? Or what brought you into the space? That's for everyone.
Okay, this was a pretty easy decision for me. Before I joined the Graph, I was working at AWS, and AWS was really compelling to me because it was like a developer platform, and I really enjoyed being able to kind of work on the tools that other people are using as primitives to build out their own applications. So when I started diving into the Web3 ecosystem, there was a handful of protocols that were kind of interesting for me to work with. And while I do find NFTs and DeFi and stuff like that pretty interesting, I really enjoy working on developer tooling and developer protocols and stuff like that. So, the Graph fits directly into that, as a layer for developers to build out Web3 applications. It just made a lot of sense for me. I was also checking out a couple of other layer 1 protocols, stuff like, in addition to that, Arweave, IPFS, all of these teams, protocol labs and stuff seem really interesting to me. But the Graph as a crucial part of the Web3 stack. Seemed really interesting to me, so I wanted to work with them. And I also knew GraphQL because I was working on a GraphQL service at AWS for a little over 3 years, and the graph uses GraphQL. So that's how it happened.
Cool, very cool.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I decided to go into infrastructure, before starting my own company, I was working at Opera browser. We built a non-custodial crypto wallet inside the browser first time. One of the first things we decided to do, go multi-chain, and there we actually really realized how difficult it was to actually connect, understand how to set up the nodes, interact with it. And as we expanded more chains, it just became a pretty big nightmare. We understood pretty quickly that, if you want to develop decentralized applications on top, that's the first kind of pain point that you have. And to really have a good ecosystem on this layer of decentralized apps, you need to be able to have a very strong infrastructure. I mean, the reality, if you move away from Ethereum, it's been battle tested for many years. You see a lot of the higher level APIs, better tooling for developers really coming out, which is great to see. But I think a lot of these new L1s have, they're trying to battle everything at the same time, and it becomes a bit complicated for a new developer coming in. I have calls with new developers almost on a daily basis asking, hey guys, I have this problem, how can you help? They're not going directly to the L1s. One of the things that we spend a lot of time is really working closely with the L1 foundations to really understand what is the roadmap, what's happening, what kind of area of focus do they have. Because I think also what you see, again, everybody's about scalability and having additional segments and really finding out what is their niche. And I think a lot of the new L1s need to find that space, right, and how to provide the development tools. So yeah, I believe in Web3, and that's one of the reasons I got into the infrastructure, because that's where it all begins. Without a very strong infrastructure, anything on top is just going to be painful, and we're just at the beginning. So that's my story.
E.G., can you tell us your story?
Yeah, I've always kind of worked in developer tools, or very, very close to like the developer-focused applications. And it was in 2015 that a friend of mine introduced me to Ethereum. He said, have you heard about Bitcoin? I said, of course I've heard about Bitcoin. He said, well, what about Ethereum? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, you should really take a look at it. They've got this smart contract thing. It could be really cool. And I know this guy, Joe Lubin. I could introduce you to him. I'm like, who's this guy, Joe? And he introduced me to Joe, and Joe told me about what they were doing at Consensus, where Consensus was supposed to be this place where you were just supposed to further the growth of Ethereum. Build a project that was for Ethereum, whether it was a smart contract application or tools. It was like get funded to work on Ethereum. And that was like a pretty open and exciting concept. And so I joined with no specific idea in mind other than wanting to start to understand the problem space. So I met with some other people within Consensus. Some people were working on decentralized identity. Honestly, I didn't know what it was at the time. And or putting music rights on the blockchain and really other really interesting ideas. And nothing really clicked until I met somebody that said, one of our co-founders said, everybody that we run into in this space is super talented and extremely smart, and they're all having issues running their infrastructure. And coming from an infrastructure background, that immediately clicked. And I really felt like that was a place where I could immediately contribute and help further the growth of the space and provide value. And it was very clear that it was a need, that there was like latent demand for something like Infura, and so we built it.
Yeah, and Infura supports like the Graph and soon to be Gateway FM, so many crucial projects. So what are some of the projects that you've powered? What are some of the most interesting use cases that you've seen emerge over the years? And what were their challenges? What were they able to overcome as they scaled?
So the interesting thing to think about is because Infura was the first service of its kind in this space, pretty much everybody was using Infura at one point. And when you think back to like 2017 in particular, all of the ICOs that happened during that phase were basically done doing Infura. I remember getting paged in the middle of the night. Our team got paged in the middle of the night when the Tezos sale happened, when the EOS sale happened, what were some of the other ones? Can't think of any off. Oh, Aragon. Aragon was one. Compound, 0x. There's if there was an ICO that happened in 2017, it was likely using Infura in the background, whether it was the application itself or because people were using MetaMask to interact with the blockchain. And that was really when we realized what we had helped do for the ecosystem, where so many people could participate in it without there being any sort of barrier to entry other than install MetaMask. So that was really gratifying.
That makes sense if the barrier to entry is so low. What about you, Nader? Has there ever been any particular subgraph that's had challenges due to an event triggering? And can you talk about how maybe you guys were able to overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like as you're developing and building subgraphs, you kind of learn best practices and things like that. One of the things that often slows developers down is if you make too many, contract calls from directly within a subgraph, because every contract call is a network request. So therefore, every transaction that needs to be indexed ends up kind of like multiplying that. So that's like a multiplier. So if you have 50 contract calls per event, then you now are like multiplying the number of network calls by 50. But there's a lot of different kind of like best practices. We've documented some of those in our documentation. But in general, like some of the work that we do is to kind of make it for the developer experience, so developers don't even actually have to think about that sort of stuff. So in addition to adding new features and adding new networks, one of the things we do are just like working on developer experience, and part of that is being able to kind of build into the actual APIs and all the tooling things that kind of make developers' lives easier without them having to think about it.
That's great. Okay, cool. So I would love to open it up to you guys for your questions. Anyone want to step up to the mic? Any brave souls with some questions for our panelists? Anybody? No? Okay, well, we'll continue, and if you feel like you'd like to ask a question, just step up to the mic.
I've actually got a question for Nader.
Cool, yeah, let's open it up to you guys.
I've got a question for you, Nader. I'm curious to hear about the challenges of scaling the graph across multiple protocols, because I think that's a challenge that all of us have.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
The challenges of scaling the graph across multiple chains.
Oh, multiple chains, right. So right now the graph is supporting a lot of different EVM networks. So for us to build out a new EVM network into the graph, it's actually not that hard because a lot of the APIs and functionality is almost exactly the same. But we've also recently added support for Cosmos, Near, and Solana, or at least roadmap those. Near is already ready to go, and you can use it today. So when we add a new EVM network, it's actually not that complicated. But when we add a non-EVM network, it is very complicated, and it takes a lot of time and work, and often we actually bring in another team just to focus on that and do that alone, just because it is so much work and it is so complicated. So right now we have the hosted service, which supports a lot of different networks, and then we also have the decentralized network, which for now only supports Ethereum layer 1, but part of our roadmap this year is to actually add more networks to the decentralized networks. But yeah, it's definitely a lot of work, and trying to figure out which networks to support, listening to the developers, trying to understand the ecosystem, see where the usage is, all that drives our decisions, I would say.
Cool, okay, well, I don't see any audience questions, so we'll just kind of keep going. E.G., this morning in your talk, you had mentioned hybrid structures, hybrid infrastructures. Can you contextualize that within the scalability of APIs? Super technical.
Yeah, absolutely. So I very much like to approach things in a collaborative manner. Like even though we offer similar services, I'm a huge fan of the graph. I got a chance to just know Temoc and hear about their product, and it sounds awesome, and I'm looking forward to working with them as well. That when So our APIs are very similar and very compatible in terms of Gateway and Infura. And it doesn't need to be a choice of just using Infura or just using Gateway. You have the opportunity, because we support this open standard API, to use both and have a structure in place that's resilient, more resilient than just using one provider. Sure, like just as a single provider, we have resiliency already built into our service. But when you take that and expand it out across like an organizational boundary, it almost becomes pretty much bulletproof in terms of like what sort of disaster or incident can affect both entities. Like, and then it's up to the person that's building it to really think about like what their tolerance is for failure, and then build the system appropriately. Same thing with the graph. There's a lot of data that you can get through the graph that you can also get through our services, and vice versa. And so it's just like a different method of querying the data. So I've seen people architect things that if you use the graph, you can pull the data through it, or it can fall back to using Infura if somebody doesn't have that index node available.
Yeah, that's super inspiring, and something, somewhat of a best practice for building. And it's great that this hybrid infrastructure can actually encourage us not depending on one solution, but utilizing many. I can't recall the title of Moxie's. It's slipping my mind right now. Of Moxie's Web3
you can just call it
critique.
the Moxie article, yeah.
Yeah, so it was brilliant. If you haven't read it, check it out. Published, I think it was early January, but essentially, and Infura was mentioned in the context of, still a lot of reliance on the API. But this morning, you had mentioned that, there isn't a dependency, there's just a utility. So could you kind of expand on that, and maybe continue to expand on the way that your projects can be integrated and hopefully inspire, a greater use of diverse APIs?
Yeah, sure, and I'd be interested in hearing their thoughts on it as well. That what I said in my talk earlier was there's some truth in it, in that a lot of applications use Infura, but none of them solely depend on Infura, and that's a big difference. Where you're able to use Infura, or you could use Gateway. Other people are also using the graph in places where you could use Infura. And it's really up to the developer to architect their application to be resilient.
Yeah, I enjoy reading critiques of Web3, and I really enjoy when someone actually comes with the approach that is well-intentioned and isn't kind of like trying to be toxic, because we've seen a lot of discourse between like people that are pro and against Web3, and it seems to be very, very polarizing for certain people, and they can't really have a conversation in the context of trade-offs. And I don't think like you would say Web3 is like ultimately going to save the world, or it's going to destroy the world. In reality, there are just technology primitives that we now have to build applications. And I think part of his post his post overall was like very well intentioned, but I think there were definitely areas where maybe he was missing the mark a little bit, and maybe that either that or we have very differing opinions around some of the points he was making. But the overall arching point around data verifiability I thought was pretty interesting, and that's kind of one of the problems that the graph tries to solve. Because like if you have a decentralized network of indexers and you have a network of participants that are kind of working to verify the data that's being returned, you can kind of know that the data is correct and verified, I guess you could say.
Any thoughts you want to share on that piece as it relates to what you're building, Temoc? I think we've got one minute.
Yeah, just real quick. So, some of the things that we're looking at for us when we go multi-chain, it's really just to understand very clearly like what's going to be the applications. One of the discrepancies that we see in the space today is mainly the hardware is not really to the level that the software is. So I think in the future there's going to be more hardware-dependent blockchain infrastructure. I think that's going to be a big part in the future, because today it's a big pain point in this space. So we're talking a little bit about hybrid cloud. Again, understanding what's the infrastructure and the lane to support all these blockchain is really complex, and it just requires a lot of time. So I think the future is going to be very interesting when it comes to high performance computing, the metaverse.
Yeah, the future is bright for blockchain data and APIs. So keep building. I think are we at time?
Awesome.
We're good?
Thank you.
Think we're done.
That's
Are
it.
we
Thank
good?
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.